The land had always been mine, passed down through generations, each ancestor leaving their mark on the earth in their own quiet way. It wasn't just soil and trees. It was history, memory, and the foundation of my family's legacy. My grandfather had built a small cabin by the creek, where he'd spent endless hours fishing and watching the world go by. My father had planted rows of fruit trees, each one a symbol of perseverance and love. And I, as the inheritor of this land, had poured my heart into maintaining its beauty, its serenity. It was my sanctuary, the one place in the world that felt completely mine. But all that changed the day the HOA, the Homeowners Association, came knocking. It started as a simple request, an offer to purchase the land. They sent their representatives, suited and polished, to present me with a number. It was generous, they said, considering the development potential of the property. It wasn't just land to them. It was a prime location for new homes, a perfect spot for suburban expansion. I listened politely, even though I had no intention of selling. This land was more than just a plot of earth. It was part of who I was, part of my family story. The thought of strangers coming in and carving it up for profit seemed unthinkable. I politely turned them down, but the rejection didn't sit well with the HOA. They came back with a higher offer. This time, they sent their lawyers. They assured me that the deal was in my best interest, that the land was worth more than I thought, and that I could use the money to do whatever I wanted: travel, invest, move away. But I wasn't interested in what they were offering. I wasn't selling, not now, not ever. And then they began to escalate. It wasn't long before I noticed surveyors walking the property. They were marking boundaries, placing flags in the dirt, and drawing lines that I knew didn't belong. I called the HOA office, but the response was always the same. They were just preparing for the future. They promised me that everything was still on the table, that we could work out a deal, but the actions on the ground spoke volumes. The bulldozers arrived soon after. First, they tore into the tree line, ripping out the decades-old oaks and pines. The clearing of the land had begun, and I was helpless to stop it. I spent the next few weeks trying everything I could to halt the destruction. I contacted lawyers, attended meetings, but it was clear that the HOA had the money, the power, and the political backing. Every attempt I made to challenge them in court was met with more legal jargon, more technicalities, more threats. I felt like I was fighting an army that knew exactly how to play the game. They had the resources to wear me down, to bury me under a pile of paperwork. The land that had been in my family for generations was now at risk of being lost to developers with no attachment to it, no understanding of its significance. It didn't matter that the land had been home to my ancestors or that it was rich with memories. To the HOA, it was just real estate, just another prime piece of land to be bought and sold. The homes they planned to build were worth millions, and that was all that mattered to them. I started seeing the changes daily. The once quiet space, where I had enjoyed peace and solitude, was now filled with the sound of chainsaws and heavy machinery. The natural landscape was giving way to man-made structures, and with each passing day, the spirit of the land seemed to slip further and further away. But what struck me the hardest was the complete lack of respect. The HOA had given no consideration to the way the land would be affected by their development. They had no interest in the ecological balance, the wildlife, or the water systems that had shaped the area for centuries. Their plans were focused solely on profit, with no regard for the damage they were causing to the environment. I began to wonder if they even realized what they were destroying. One morning, as I walked along the creek, I noticed a bulldozer had nearly reached the water's edge. The creek that had provided fresh water for generations was now being diverted. The construction was too close, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before the natural flow of water would be compromised, potentially flooding parts of the land that had been untouched for hundreds of years. I couldn't stand by and watch this any longer. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the land wasn't just something I had to protect for myself. It was my duty to protect it for my family, my ancestors, and for the generations yet to come. That's when I made the decision. I was going to fight back, not with lawyers or protests, but with the one thing the HOA couldn't control: the land itself. The dam was my last line of defense, built years ago by my grandfather, It had been designed to control the flow of water from the creek and prevent flooding in the lower valley. Over the years, it had become an integral part of the land's ecosystem, a natural barrier that kept the water level steady. But now it was my weapon. I knew the water, the very thing that had nurtured the land for so long, could be used to reclaim it. If the developers wanted to destroy what my family had built, I would make sure they understood that there were consequences for messing with nature. I had lived with this land for my whole life, and I knew how it worked. I knew where the water would flow, and I knew how to make the dam do what I needed it to do. I wasn't just going to stop the construction. I was going to send a message. If the HOA wanted to take my land, they were going to have to pay for it, and that payment was going to come in the form of a flood. The first few days after the bulldozers arrived were the hardest. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of chainsaws and machinery. The landscape I had known and loved for so long was changing right before my eyes, and with each passing day, I felt a deeper sense of loss. I had always imagined my children running across the land, playing by the creek, and hearing their laughter echo through the trees. Now, all of that seemed like a distant dream. I wasn't just angry at the HOA or the developers. I was angry at myself for not taking action sooner. But even in my anger, I knew one thing. I had to take control of the situation before it was too late. I couldn't stand idly by while they destroyed everything my family had worked for. The night I decided to take action was the night I finally made peace with myself. The land had always been mine to protect, and if the HOA wanted to steal it, I would make them pay. I had watched the creek and the lake for years, studying the way water flowed through the land. I knew every bend, every drop, and every pressure point where the water could be manipulated. The dam had been built by my grandfather. It was a simple structure, but it was incredibly effective. For decades, it had kept the water level steady, preventing flooding during storms and maintaining the delicate balance of the ecosystem. But I knew it wasn't just a tool for preservation anymore. It was a weapon, and it was the only thing I could use to stop the encroachment. I had made up my mind. I would open the dam and release the water. The flood would wash away the foundations of the homes they were trying to build. It wasn't just a matter of revenge. It was about sending a message that there were consequences to destroying something sacred. That night, under the cover of darkness, I made my way to the dam. The night air was still, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees. I had been to the dam countless times before, but this time was different. As I approached, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. But I didn't hesitate. I had to do it for the land, for my family, and for the future. With a steady hand, I began to loosen the locks on the gates. The sound of the metal groaning as the locks gave way was almost deafening in the silence of the night. As the gates creaked open, I could feel the water begin to move. It was a slow trickle at first, but then it began to pick up speed, like a mighty river being set free. I stood there, watching as the water poured through the gap in the dam, flowing faster and faster as it headed toward the construction site. It was a calculated move. I didn't want to flood the entire area, but I knew if I released enough water, it would wreak havoc on the foundations they had just begun to lay. The water would erode the dirt and gravel, weaken the concrete, and force them to abandon the construction. The message would be loud and clear. This land was not to be taken lightly. As I watched the water rush forward, I felt a strange sense of calm. There was no going back now, but I didn't regret my decision. The flood had been a last resort, but it was necessary. It wasn't just about protecting the land anymore. It was about protecting the history and the legacy that had been passed down to me. This land had been in my family for generations, and I wasn't going to let some developers tear it apart without consequences. By the time the water had reached the construction site, it was already too late. The first signs of erosion began to appear, and I could hear the distant shouts of the workers as they scrambled to secure the site. But they were powerless against the force of nature. The water swelled, crashing against the makeshift barriers they had put in place, flooding the area with ease. The foundations they had poured began to crack and crumble, and within minutes, the water had taken control of the site. The homes they were trying to build were now a distant dream, submerged in the flood. I stood there, watching the chaos unfold before me. The construction site, once filled with the hum of machinery and the promise of new homes, was now a muddy, waterlogged mess. The developers had underestimated not just the power of the land, but the power of the person who had lived on it for so long. The flood didn't just ruin their construction. It forced them to reevaluate their plans. The next morning, I watched from the hillside as workers trudged through the muck, trying to salvage what little they could. It was a slow and painful process, but it was clear that the flood had done its job. The site was uninhabitable, and the developers would have to start from scratch. They wouldn't be able to proceed with their plans until the water had receded, and by then, I knew they would have to think long and hard about how to continue. But I wasn't done. I had sent my message, but I knew that the HOA would fight back. They wouldn't let this setback stop them. They would come up with another plan, find another way to try and take what wasn't theirs. But I wasn't going to back down. If they wanted this land, they would have to face the consequences of their actions, again and again, until they understood that the land couldn't be taken without cost. As the days passed, I watched the aftermath of the flood. The construction site was a mess, but so was the HOA's plan. They would have to deal with the legal repercussions, the financial losses, and the damage to their reputation. They had thought they could take my land without a fight, but they had underestimated the spirit of the land itself. The flood had been a reminder that nature, in its own quiet way, could resist even the most powerful forces. And as for me, I knew I had done the right thing. I had fought for the land, for my family's legacy, and for the future. The HOA might have had the money and the power, but I had something they could never take, a deep, unshakable connection to the land that had shaped my family for generations. They might have thought they could destroy it, but they hadn't counted on the one thing that would always protected me.